Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining me. My name's Andy. This is the next in this series of flipped preaching videos. The idea is that you get a chance to think about the passage for the coming Sunday before Sunday. So when you come in church and you hear this passage preached on, you've got a bit of a background knowledge and you've thought about it beforehand. This week we've got taking a passage from the book of John, John 2:13 to 22. So have a look at the link below, or read it in your Bible. It's Jesus cleansing the temple. Okay, now before we get into what it means, I wanted to just spend a minute or two thinking about the differences between the four different gospel accounts. Okay, now you probably know this, but if you don't, there are four gospels. There are four accounts of Jesus' life in the scriptures. In order, the order they appear in the Bible, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And three of them, the first three, are quite similar, but the fourth one, John, is very different. Now, I'll put them to one side for a minute. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all have the same basic outline. They've got the same structure. There are huge chunks which are identical in each of them. They're very, very clearly related. People think that Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke, which are much longer, took Mark and added bits in that they thought that Mark had left out, that they thought were important. So Mark is the first one written. It's the simplest and, in a way, the crudest, and the language isn't very neat. Matthew and Luke sort of embellished it and made it a bit fuller. But these three are all basic. They're not basically the same. They're very different. They're actually different, but they've got a lot in common. And they're called, we use a posh Greek word for these, called the Synoptic Gospels. Syn means, S-Y-N, means together, like synthesis. Optic means seeing, so it means that they see together. They've got a common vision about the life of Jesus. Okay, now the fourth gospel, John, is very different. It doesn't have the same plot line. There's very little in common with the others in a way. And it's the same Jesus, of course, so there are similarities, but John approaches things from a very, very different angle. And sometimes there's an event that happens in John which is quite different to the way it happens in the Synoptics, and today's is one of those. This story of the cleansing of the temple, we'll come back to it later, but very briefly, what happened is Jesus went to Jerusalem, to the temple, which was the centre of the faith, and where all the religious power was held. And he went in and staged a little mini rebellion, really. A little rebellion against the system there. And it got him into big trouble. Now, in the Synoptics, this story happens near the end. In the Synoptics, Jesus only goes to Jerusalem once. He spends most of his time in Galilee, in the countryside, in the north of the country. But he only ever goes to Jerusalem right at the end of the story, in the Passion Week. So the cleansing of the temple in the Synoptics happens right before his death. He basically spends all of his life outside of Jerusalem, goes there once, cleanses the temple, gets in trouble, and that's what sparks the process of him being arrested and executed. So it happens right towards the end. This is the beginning of the end. However, in John, it happens right near the start. Jesus calls his disciples, he takes them to the wedding in Cana, where he turns water into wine, and then he goes to Jerusalem and cleanses the temple. Now, people have wondered about this for a long time, whether it's the same event, and it seems very likely that it was, because there's a lot of similarity. So the question is, did it actually happen at the start of Jesus' ministry or at the end? is very tricky to say. I think the consensus among people who really sort of look at this in depth is that John probably put it in the wrong place in his story, because you couldn't do that and get away with it for so long. If it happened at the start of Jesus's ministry, he would have been killed a lot sooner. So probably John has taken this story and moved it to a different place for a reason. It probably did happen right at the end. So John has done something with this. He's taken this story and he's put it in a different part of his gospel, quite near the start, to make a point. So we're going to try and think about what that point might be today. Okay, with me so far? Good. John's passage begins by reminding us that it was near to the Passover. Now, the Passover was an annual festival. Everybody, all the Jews were meant to go to Jerusalem to celebrate this at the temple. And it remembers the time when the Israelite nation was born, when they were slaves in Egypt under the rule of Pharaoh. God saved them from their slavery, called them out of Egypt, parted the Red Sea. You probably know the story. And they went into the wilderness of Sinai, and then they wandered there 40 years. So John is wanting to tie this cleansing of the temple with the Passover, perhaps. Okay, so it says that Jesus went into the temple and he found people selling oxen and sheep. Now that's only in John. The synoptics talk about people selling doves, but John adds in these big mammals that were being sold for sacrifice, and also some doves, and also some people who were changing coins. And Jesus made a whip out of ropes. That's unique to John, the fact that Jesus made a whip, and he used this whip to drive people out of the temple with all of their animals, and he turned over the tables with the money changers, throwing money everywhere. He made a real scene, in other words. And somehow in John, as we said, he seemed to get away with it. He wasn't punished for that as you would have been in that time. If you made such a disturbance in the temple, that would have been the end of you. Okay, now, why did Jesus do this? Let's try and think about his motivation. Why did he create a scene, probably knowing that it would lead to his death? Unfortunately, no one really knows. It's not very clear. There are different opinions about what was going on. It's likely that in the synoptic gospels, the issue that Mark seems to raise is that he says, "You turned my house into a house of sinners." He seems to be complaining about the people who were selling stuff, that they were somehow exploiting the poor, maybe they were making it difficult for people who weren't Jews to worship in the temple, because all of this selling activity happened in the outer areas where Gentiles, people who weren't Jews, were allowed to go. So the bit that they were allowed into was the bit that also had all this commercial activity in. So maybe that was what the problem was. But in John's Gospel, it's slightly different. We don't really get a sense of that he was concerned about the money aspects. Now people in those days in Judaism, people needed to sacrifice animals for God to cleanse them of their sins. Also, they thought that was the religious system of the day. So there was a need to buy animals. We don't think that they were charging extortionate amounts. There's an account, a really interesting account before this happened, where one of the chief priests decided to radically cut the price of doves so they were more affordable, and he cut them by 99%. He managed to get the price of a dove reduced by 99% of what it was, so it's much more affordable for for poor people to take part in it. So it's not necessarily the case that these people selling the animals were doing it exploitatively. The money changing, that again was necessary. There was a particular type of currency that people had to pay to the temple as part of their religious life. They had to pay a sort of tithe to the temple, and that had to be in a particular currency. So people who were coming in from all different countries, and I mean even the normal money that they used in the country, you couldn't use that in the temple. You had to have it exchanged. So there had to be these money changers. And there's no sense anywhere else that the money changers were particularly evil or exploitative. Unlike tax collectors, money changers were generally thought of as quite respectable. So we're not quite sure what the problem was. Perhaps it is something to do with this Passover. Jesus wanted to set people free from where they were held in slavery. Now, maybe there's something about Jesus wanting to free people from this need to go to the temple and to sacrifice animals and to have your spiritual salvation, to have your what's true in life, your communion with God, your walk with God, to have that done in such a commercial, fixed way. Perhaps that's what he was getting at. This passage, remember, came just after the wedding at Cana, where he took the stone jars, which represented the old system of purifying people. They held the water for purification, and he made it pour forth this wine. There's a sense of, out of this old stone cold system, this new life flowed. Perhaps there's something similar going on here. Out of the old system of the temple, this new relationship with God would flow. But first it had to be broken. But first it had to be shaken up. Like in the Passover story, that you'll know that the Passover was accompanied by a series of plagues. It was only through this messy, broken conflict with evil that the deliverance of the Israelites could happen. Maybe there's something similar going on here. Through creating this mess and this chaos, Jesus was symbolizing that the temple's days were over. This was the beginning of the end of the temple. The passage goes on to give John's account of what this all means, and it's all about Jesus saying, if you destroy me, if you destroy my body, I'll be raised again in 3 days. And they seemed to get confused because they thought he was saying about destroying the temple and rebuilding that in 3 days, which would have been impossible. So Jesus is saying that actually the temple that this physical huge structure with all of its money and doves and oxen, all of that, its time is numbered. A new wave of God is coming. And the place where you'll find God, the place where God happens, is no longer in this building. It's through me. It's through the death and my resurrection. That's where the new life comes from. So Jesus, by causing this scene in the temple, he was prophetically giving the sign that the temple's days were numbered. It was beginning to be broken. So I hope that helps. So what it means for us today, where do we find God? In those days, the temple system very neatly defined where you would find God. You would go to the temple on a certain day, or if you had a certain thing you wanted to do, you would buy this, you would do that, and that's how you met with God. And Jesus is saying, no, that's no longer the case. You find God through me, and you find God through my my death and my resurrection. Now that can happen everywhere. So where's God in the world? It's through whenever you find brokenness in new life. And as the church today, we're the inheritors of this movement. When we have Holy Communion, we reenact this story of Jesus being broken and celebrate his new life with us. So as we approach Easter, we've got to, in the season of Lent, perhaps we need to think about letting ourselves be broken, letting some of the human things we talked of last week be broken away, letting some of the things that we're used to, the things that used to speak, help us to meet with God. Maybe they need to be broken up, because Jesus is alive and it's a living thing, and it's not tied to anything predictable like the temple was. In these videos, I want to each week show you one of the paintings that are coming as part of the Methodist art collection, which is coming shortly to the island. So this is this week's one. There isn't really a painting of this scene, so I'm going to show you something that I think might help. This is it's a painting. It's not actually a painting. It was an etching that was turned into a print by an artist called Craigie Atchison, 2004. It's called The Pink Crucifixion. A very simple image. It's got, I think it's obvious what it is. It's got Jesus' broken body on the cross. But there's a sense of playfulness with it. The fact that it's got this Barbie pink background, there's this tension in it. Half of it is incredibly sad and tragic, but half of it's very joyful. Now, I don't quite know what was intended by the artist here. Perhaps you've got some ideas, perhaps it means something to you, but I thought I'd just share this as a way of reflecting on brokenness and new life. Okay, thanks for listening. If you want to leave a comment below, if you have anything you want to ask, or if you have something you disagree with, or if you want to make your own suggestions, that's great. Think about it, pray about it. What is it for you that might need to be broken in this Lent season? Have you got things which are the equivalent of money changer tables and oxen, stuff which you've always done, you've always thought brought you to God, but actually might need to go? Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.